Hello, I'm Jonathan Perlow, Communications Director for Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Thanks for joining us tonight for our forum, How Community Gun Violence is Devastating Youth. It's great to see so many of you in the audience. CAGV's mission is to end gun violence in Connecticut. We're the only gun violence prevention organization exclusively focused on legislative and policy measures in Connecticut, which we've been doing for nearly 30 years. But I know we have a lot of people joining from across the country, and I'm confident that you'll find tonight's program relevant wherever you live. The program starts with Shell Shocked, the documentary that shows the pervasive impact of interpersonal gun violence on young Blacks in New Orleans. Although it was released in 2013, its message is still every bit as relevant today as it was then. What was happening in New Orleans a decade ago is still happening in Black and Brown communities in Connecticut and across the US. After the film, which runs just about an hour, please stay for our panel discussion moderated by CAGV's Executive Director, Jeremy Stein, which will also run for about an hour, so it will be ending around 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. The panel features John Richie, the director of Shell Shocked, Patrick Young, who directs the New Orleans Office of Gun Violence Prevention, Brent Peterkin, who served as the statewide director for Project Longevity, Connecticut's implementation of the Operation Ceasefire Group Violence Intervention Model, and Dr. Chico Tillmon, who worked as a violence interrupter in Chicago with Cure Violence, served as executive director of the Metro Chicago YMCA Youth Safety and Violence Prevention Initiative, and is now a senior research fellow at the University of Chicago Urban Labs. We started planning this forum long before last week's school shooting in Michigan. We wanted to bring more attention to the public health crisis of street-level gun violence that is traumatizing entire communities on a daily basis, especially Black and Hispanic youth. And we wanted to highlight the community-based programs that are reducing gun violence in these neglected neighborhoods, the types of prevention and intervention programs that Brent, Chico, and Patrick have led that de-escalate conflict, break cycles of retribution, and most importantly, provide opportunities that lead away from violence. And we need to talk about how these programs are woefully underfunded here in Connecticut and elsewhere. But then the Oxford High School shooting happened. The media coverage has been intense, as it should be. While thankfully the actual risk of a student being shot at school is extremely low, the trauma we are inflicting on millions of students and educators is a national disgrace. Here in Connecticut over the past week, there have been at least a half dozen threats that have led to lockdowns and school closings. Students can't learn, and teachers can't teach if they're scared for their lives. But the thing is, that's what young people in Black and Brown neighborhoods experience every day. And it's not getting the media attention it warrants, which means elected officials aren't hearing from the public to do something. So the crisis continues. And the really important difference compared to school shootings is that the threat is far greater that a young Black or Hispanic person will be shot or killed in a community gun violence incident than anyone will be in a school mass shooting. Not only is the risk of being shot or killed so much higher, the toxic effect of exposure to violence has devastating consequences for these youth, even when they aren't direct victims of violence, gun violence. Children exposed to violence have more difficulty learning and are more likely to have lifelong consequences that include drug and alcohol abuse, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and engaging in criminal activity. That's why we're holding tonight's forum, to call attention to this ongoing crisis of community gun violence and to talk about what we can do and need to do to prevent it, which demands that government invest more in the community-based programs that Jeremy and the panel will talk about after the screening. Thanks again for your time this evening, and now let's watch Shell Shocked. This is now the third time I've seen Shell Shocked, and each time I find it incredibly powerful, and it brings tears to my eyes. It also gives us a lot to talk about, which is what we're going to do with our panel now, led by Jeremy Stein, who is Executive Director of Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Let me take a moment to introduce our four very distinguished panelists. For nearly 6 years, Brent Peterkin focused on reducing community-level gun violence in Hartford, Bridgeport, and New Haven as the statewide director for Project Longevity, a nationally recognized program of Connecticut's U.S. Attorney's Office. Brent also served on the Governor's Youth and Urban Violence Commission and the Bridgeport Mayor's Initiative for Reentry Affairs. During his time with Project Longevity, Brent's work also involved advocacy in support of criminal justice policy reform, focusing on formerly incarcerated individuals. Brent studied public policy and administration, nonprofit leadership, business administration, and social impact strategy at Fordham, Northwestern, and Howard Universities, and the University of Pennsylvania. His commitment to social change led to his recognition in 2017 as an honoree of Connecticut Magazine's 40 Under 40 and 100 Men of Color 2017 honoree. Currently, Brent is the executive director of Gather New Haven, a social and environmental impact organization that focuses on community development by fostering connections to the natural world. John Richie is a director and producer who specializes in social justice documentaries. He was a producer on BET's Boiling Point, a 6-part docuseries which examines systemic racism through the lens of current historical events. John has worked as the social media producer for Bravo's Project Runway for multiple seasons. He has directed and produced 2 feature-length documentaries involving gun violence in the United States, Shell Shock, that we just saw this evening, which premiered on PBS's America Reframed series in 2015, and his second documentary, 91%, continues to be used as a tool to build support for gun legislation reform. It was about the 91% of Americans who support universal background checks. John continues to work on his series Waterways, which takes a look at the community struggle along Louisiana's disappearing coast and the state's efforts to combat climate change and the negative effects of industry. Our third panelist is Dr. Chico Tillmon, a senior research fellow at the University of Chicago Urban Labs and a violence prevention expert who currently consults with Houston, Austin, Cities United, and Life Camp in Queens, New York. He's the former executive director of the YWMCA of Metro Chicago's youth safety and violence prevention programs, and one of the leading national consultants and trainers for violence prevention, reentry, and nonprofit organizations. After serving 16 years in prison, Chico came home with a purpose of trying to change his community in a positive way. He works with youth and young adults in marginalized areas to help them hone their skills professionally and improve their work performance. He believes professional development can lead to economic growth and improve the quality of life for men and women in our most vulnerable communities. Dr. Tillmon was recognized for his work by President Biden. He was the recipient of the 2018 Congressional Veterans Brain Trust Award and the 2017 Ford Men of Courage Award for his work in Chicago's most vulnerable communities. He was also awarded the Practitioner of the Year in 2016 by the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Tillmon holds a PhD in criminology, law, and justice from University of Illinois at Chicago. Chico is also a veteran who served in the Illinois Air National Guard. And Patrick Young currently serves as the director for the Mayor's Office of Gun Violence Prevention in New Orleans. The Office of Gun Violence Prevention is the backbone of the city's efforts to work with New Orleans to create peace and prevent gun violence. Prior to working with the mayor, he served the New Orleans Business Alliance as the director of training, managing the Strive Work Readiness training program that operated throughout 4 opportunity centers in the city of New Orleans, helping to employ over 600 formerly incarcerated persons in less than 3 years. Patrick is the founder and executive director of Sharp Men, a nonprofit that helps men overcome barriers to employment. He was selected as a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Fellow for his proven leadership and dedication to making the city of New Orleans one of the best cities in the world. Patrick was recently asked to be part of the transition team for newly elected DA Jason Williams, assisting him with developing strategic solutions to address ethnic and racial disparities. So our panelists tonight just have incredible hands-on expertise in running and actually doing the work of preventing community gun violence that we want to talk about tonight. So I turn you over now to Jeremy, Patrick, Chico, John, and Brent to have what should be a very rewarding discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for being here, everyone. It's really, I'm really humbled to be in the presence of all of you. So thank you for joining us. So I wanted to just kind of phrase this. Having seen the movie again tonight, I watched it a while ago. but it always remarks me that this movie could have been made today. Could have been made today about any number of cities in the United States. I think the movie said it, 50 years, over 10,000 people were murdered. Since 2005, more people lost their lives in New Orleans than Katrina. So, John, I want to start with you. Why is this film so important to you? Why was it so important for you to make this film, and why should it be important to us?
Well, so Shell Shock was the first documentary that I made, and at the time that I started the project, I've been living in New Orleans for probably about 8 years because I moved there to go to college and then I stayed. And so most of my time, that I was there, I was, I was doing college. So I wasn't, about half that time I wasn't familiar with the rest of New Orleans because I was really deeply in my studies. But, as, the years went by, I decided to stay there because I love the city. And, so anyway, I had this moment around 2008, I guess it was 2007, 2008, to where I was asked to work with a group of teenagers in New Orleans. There's this program that this woman named Sabrina Short was running that was called the Fountain of Youth Foundation, and it was a leadership program. And you had 12 African American kids from across the whole metro area, in this program. And so they were wanting to put together like an anti-violence program, and the kids were not really into it. At first I thought it was because they thought that it was something that was, kind of, that wasn't going to be cool to other kids and stuff like that, But so we kept on trying to workshop it, trying to come up with ideas, and they just weren't really into it, or we really weren't getting anywhere. So I asked them to take out a piece of paper and write about a time that they either witnessed, experienced, or perpetrated violence. And as they started writing their experience, their testimonies, and I started picking them up, each one of them was a story that or like an essay that they were writing about either a friend or a family member that was shot in front of them, and so, me being a white guy in New Orleans that wasn't from New Orleans, that was not my experience. And also another thing is that it wasn't my reality living in the same city that these kids were living in. I knew the statistics. I knew that New Orleans had the highest murder rate per capita at that time. But what I did not know was that what that statistic meant was that every African-American kid was going to be directly touched by gun violence, and that just it's not normal for children. It's not normal for human beings for that to be their reality. And I was, so I found this moment to where I was kind of a little bit kind of shocked and even a little bit ashamed of myself, to be living in this area where there was so much, violence that children were experiencing, and that I was not really aware of it, and I was able to easily ignore it. And I thought that this was something that needed to be addressed. I thought it was probably one of the biggest travesties of our city, and I thought that if I wasn't aware of it in that way that I just explained it, that probably most people weren't. And so I decided that it was a documentary that needed to be made. I decided to do a deep dive into it. When I initially started the documentary, I wasn't going to offer any kind of solutions because I didn't feel like it was my place to be able to say that I knew how to fix this problem. But as I was doing research, I realized that youth programming was something that anybody can get involved in, and that it actually had a great effect as far as like in young people's lives, and that it was something that needed to. Oftentimes, the thing is that those programs are underserved, they're not funded, they're not supported, or at least especially back then. And I thought that it was something that here's something that everybody could contribute to, and it would just be also a shame to not let people know that this is something that they could do if they wanted to address this problem. So that's why I made the film, and and that's why it's important to me.
So thank you so much. And thank you for making the film. I think it's really a remarkable film. 2013, what was a while ago. And I guess at the time that this film was made, New Orleans has made great advances in trying to reduce gun violence. Patrick, I wanted to ask you about the Office of Violence Prevention. If you can talk a little bit about how that office was created, this brand new Office of Violence Prevention, how it was created and what the effect of that office is on gun violence in New Orleans.
So first, I want to thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good. What's up, Guy? I mean, John, haven't seen you in a while, but what's up? The office really, when the American Trail took over as the first African-American female mayor in the city of New Orleans, she had a focus group, and that focus group decided that the way we're going to tackle gun violence, instead of passing it from administration to administration to administration, we're actually just going to make it a solid office. So there's been programs to deal with gun violence like Cure Violence and Ceasefire, but as far as the city administrative offices, it's never had its own entity. So similar to New York, this year they decided in April to launch the first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention in the city. But notable to your point, in 2019, giving some of the initiatives and programs that were launched from the Shell Shock video, if you follow the trajectory from 2013 to 2019, New Orleans had reached 114 murders, which was the lowest in 50 years. And then in 2020 would be the first year we were scheduled to have the murder rate under 100, period. And COVID hit. And so when COVID hit, it just brought in a whole new wave of things that we're seeing, not just in New Orleans, but across the country, like this wave of violence that's spreading around. And so we went from 119 to 202. And then even now in 2021, we're still seeing an unprecedented number of shootings and killings taking place in the city. And I think it's all tied into some of the stuff that was mentioned, whether it was education, economic development, poverty, the mental health effects of being isolated. There's so many different things, but it's really putting a focus on when you have an impoverished and poverty neighborhood, what happens when you even make that condition worse? And so a lot of people are feeling desperate, and we're seeing the effects. But the office it's new. I do have some great ideas, but also to note that the funding hasn't been there since 1996 with the Dickey Amendment, and not being able to get any federal funding, but to now be able to say, hey, not only from a local level, a state level, but from a federal level, like this has to be addressed the same way we address seatbelt laws, the same way we address smoking in public places. We have to make this, it's similar to how we're addressing COVID now. We have to make this a focus of crisis urgency to fix this gun violence across the country.
Thank you, Patrick. Chico, how, thank you for being here, and thank you also for being such a great resource for us in Connecticut. How similar is what's happening in New Orleans? How similar is it to what you are seeing in Chicago and around the rest of the country? You're muted, Chico.
In Chicago, we're on the brink of reaching historic numbers not seen since the early 1990s. Currently we're at over 800 homicides, 4,000 shootings, and for the county, we're at 1,000 homicides and close to 5,000 shootings. So Chicago, because of the concentrated poverty and disinvestment over such a long period of time, is really being impacted by a plethora of things. As my colleagues stated earlier, or panelists stated earlier, the combination of disinvestment over a long period of time, along with the added pressure and stressors that come from COVID, just increased the state of hopelessness in these particular communities, and the lack of connection with positive systems and services has caused even those who were making progress to revert back to resolving conflict, which could be solved in an alternative way, with non-aggression, resorting back to conflict. And what it is, it's that mentality of scarcity with no, and it's all over. I want to plug one thing too that I've been working on. I am excited about the work that Erica and I and Fun Peace have been doing with the Biden administration and the ARP. This year we've been able to get 1.6 billion allocated, and also we're on the brink of getting the 5.3 billion passed. That would allow those funds for over 8 years to give sustainabilities to cities like New Orleans. It's already passed in the House. Now we got to keep our fingers crossed and get it over the finish line in the Senate. And I will say that President Biden did put a $220 million in his budget specifically for violence prevention this year. So I just said that for my colleague to be on the lookout. There are going to be funds dedicated specifically for violence prevention coming from the federal level for the first time in the history of America. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, Chico, congratulations. And, just some amazing work that you've been doing. And also, Erica Ford in New York has been doing. Can you talk a little bit about the historic moment in the Rose Garden and why that is so critical?
Interestingly enough, it started when the Biden administration came in with this idea around creating equity across all of the departments. However, what sparked the opportunity for us to go in the Rose Garden, unfortunately and ironically, was the spike in mass shootings in early January. The spike in mass shootings caused the administration to reach out to different experts in violence prevention to look at ways to mitigate it. And we began to create algorithms and put together a literature review of the best methods and approaches to address it. And surprisingly enough, we were heard by the administration, and we were able to help write the part of the Build Back Better bill and get monies allotted. Also, we played a key role in ARP money being allotted to different cities, counties, and state by the city, county, and state to different organizations throughout the United States. But the Rose Garden meeting was really emotional because it was the first time that any administration had declared violence a public health crisis and said that they were going to put funding behind it. So all the work that many of us, including you, Jeremy, and everybody across the country been doing throughout our careers have finally reached the highest office in the United States, and they finally feel like they're going to do something about it. So it was an exciting moment for everyone.
Yeah, really, really thank you again. And hopefully there are a lot more of those moments to be had in the future. I want to turn over to Brent Peterkin. Brent, if you can touch on some of the things that have been said, but I think, you've got a very unique perspective on this, having run Project Longevity in Connecticut and being one of the masterminds behind the Connecticut initiative, the initiative to try to get an Office of Violence Prevention in Connecticut. Can you talk a little bit about your experience with Project Longevity and just some of the themes that occurred in the movie, talking about racial disparities, lack of education, incarceration, things like that?
Sure. Thank you. And peace to all the other panelists as well. It's a privilege to be joining you all. Very honored to be amongst you brothers. Thank you for the question, Jeremy. I think, Chico really nailed it in that, there are so many causal factors. And one of the things that I experienced, I grew up in New York City, during the 90s, lived there the majority of my life. And there was a time when New York City was the murder capital, right? Then it was DC, and, you know, so on and so forth. One of the things that I realized that gun violence does to the psyche is the murder capital is actually the traumatized mind, right? That's where it exists. You know, there was a time where it actually was a signature of pride for your city to be the murder capital. And, you know, whether it was St. Louis, whether it was Philly, DC, Baltimore, it lives in the psyche of a mind that's been traumatized and oppressed and marginalized, and to the point of nihilism. And that's pretty much what we're seeing here psychologically amongst our young men. The issue with in terms of public resources is that the support is intermittent at best. You know, thankfully, because of the durable, long-standing advocacy efforts by Connecticut Against Gun Violence, my panelists, documentary films like Shell Shock that continue to amplify the seriousness of this issue, we've been able to make some significant inroads. Now, last year, we saw corporate America, we saw government on all levels, philanthropy step up and say injustice towards the Black community needs to come to an end. And you saw a doubling down of pledges that articulated a commitment to invest in our communities. Again, intermittent support is insufficient. We need sustainable activity. So whether it's on the state level or the federal level or the local level, we need to centralize the focus and make sure that there is a long-standing commitment in the sense of permanence, not just from government, but across all sectors. And that's the only way we're going to address this issue that's been going on longer than I've been alive. So with Project Longevity, you know, similarly to what was remarked on earlier, we've gone through the ebbs and flows, right? The vicissitudes of public finance are scary sometimes, right? Like, you know, sometimes the money is just not there for whatever reason. You know, some are legitimate, some are purely political. Thankfully, you know, there were advocates in our state that fought really hard to ensure that not only Project Longevity, but our colleagues, our partner organizations across the state were supported. Now, what we need, and what I'm happy to see being put forth in Connecticut is the first steps towards a long-standing commitment, right? When you have an issue that's been going on for more than 40 years at this point, you're not going to turn the corner with one-time grant funding or a 3-year grant or a 5-year grant, right? You're not going to turn the corner on it if it becomes something that gets volleyed, you know, and becomes partisan every time there's, you know, every time you go in a session to work on a budget, right? It has to be, to a certain extent, I would argue, fully insulated and something that cannot be hindered with, you know, in order for us to really say that we're serious about addressing this issue. You know, and I think that's really what it's going to take. It's going to take the political willpower, but it's more importantly, it's going to take people just making sure that we're holding people accountable and moving beyond the pledge, moving beyond intermittent support, and ensuring that there's stability there.
So Brent, let me just follow up, and I'll open this up to anyone on the panel. How, you know, you talk about the need for a long-term funding of not only groups, but also you know, strategic initiatives and others that are going to reduce gun violence in the communities. How important is the community in all of this? How important is it to have the community as part of either an Office of Violence Prevention or in you know, as part of the creation of the Office of Violence Prevention?
I think the community is integral. I think the community is the most important piece that drives the production of public safety. You know, it's the neighborhood, right? And when neighborhoods have a voice, when they're at the table, when you have power that's distributed, and people are able to get on equal footing, I think that we're able to see change. I think the community has to, be that loud voice, right? That starts to show up. Now, sometimes it's difficult, and oftentimes it is difficult. Jeremy, firsthand, it's hard to get people up to Hartford, to the Capitol. CAGV has done a tremendous job of getting a whole bunch of people in orange shirts up to the Capitol and to DC. But, that being said, it's difficult for community outside of a small subset of community members to be persistent, right? There are some of us who do this literally. It's our profession. It's what we do. It's our vocation. We do it pretty much day in, day out. But when you have a collective voice, a confluence of voices that are going to hold public officials accountable, not only public officials, but ensuring that there's some economic accountability, right? So there was a store in Bridgeport, as you know, and even in New Haven, there was a bar that was the scene of constant and escalating violence. And the community came out and essentially said, we're going to section off an area in the neighborhood. And, it's essentially a form of what they call informal social control, right? So when the community says enough's enough, that can literally draw the line in the sand and bring things to a close. And so in New Haven and in Bridgeport, we had community members on separate occasions in different years step up to areas that were considered hotspots and say, we're going to occupy this area and we're not going to move until we're heard, until we start to see a quelling of violence and a cessation of violence ensued. We need that same motivation, that same momentum at City Hall, at the state capitol, not just during election times, but every year, every session. We need those voices to speak to philanthropy. We need those who have the resources to invest in community development and invest in organizations that focus on driving down gun violence are supported, right? Far too long, we're doing this work on shoestring budgets, right? We're begging Peter to pay Paul. This makes it difficult to ensure that there's succession planning in place, right? And so, people are making choices and looking for exit strategies because it is hard work, and oftentimes you're under-resourced. So if we want to make sure that we have, a chance to really go at this for the long run, we're going to have to make sure that there's persistence and there's consistency in funding.
Thank you, Brent. Patrick, what you had mentioned earlier what sounds like the desperate need for funding. It's one thing to create an office, is another thing to make sure that there's funding to run it and to support other groups. What is it that what would you need, or what do you need to be able to make a real change in New Orleans?
First, I think it was what Brent was saying earlier. We need to stop playing the Hunger Games with funding. We're making other organizations battle against one another, eliminate one another to try to solve an issue. And it's this competition between, nonprofits, smaller nonprofits going against these bigger agencies. One of the things that we're doing here that's new and inventive is trying to do outcomes-based financing, in which we tell insurers or Medicaid providers in these hospitals that, hey, we know, for instance, that there's like 100, let's say that one person has $100,000 in Medicaid funding. If that person doesn't go to the hospital, then the insurer, Medicaid, they keep that money. But if someone gets affected with gunshots, that's almost $80,000 that they have to spend on funding that person. All right. So instead of you losing 80,000 and only keeping 20, if you give us 20,000 or 25,000 for that person, you still retain the 75, but it's funding that can go to preventing. And the more people we prevent, the more money you keep. So if they buy into it from a Medicaid perspective, given the number that we have, they'll save close to 75 million and we'll get an investment of 25 million. And it could be replicated throughout. They do it for senior centers like Gen Care. where they have centers that are given to prevent elderly people 65 or older from going to the hospital because they don't want to spend that Medicaid money. And the same way, like with a car insurance, you know, the insurance company makes money if your car doesn't get in an accident, right? We can do the same thing around gun violence. And it's just really important that, again, that we double down and stop playing these games around competitive advantage of, okay, we're going to put the Urban League against TCA and let them figure it out. No, what ways can we collaborate and get the funding that we need to really make a difference?
Thank you, Patrick. And Chico, let me expand on that a little bit. The cost of gun violence. Can you talk a little bit? And I know you and I have had these conversations before, but if you can tell our audience, can you talk a little bit about the true cost of gun violence and the importance of investing and how we can best invest in our people to reduce gun violence while saving lives at the same time?
I want to say, first, I want to start by saying it's costing us not to invest in gun violence. We spend as a country $280 billion a year because of gun violence. I think, and this is what we discussed with the administration. For one, community violence intervention needs to become a part of the public health and public safety plan, period. Not a strategy that's used sparsely and people invest in it based upon if individual organizations have some inner workings and bid. That's foolery. Because what CVI is a complementary strategy to policing that allows us to address situations before it escalate to a standard or where crime is committed or violence takes place. Police can't do what CVI does because police walk into a particular situation where no crime has been committed. There might be an argument by two individuals who have a proclivity to commit a violent act, but nothing's happened. So they either have them dispersed or whatever. It's not their job to resolve the issue, where CVI comes in and resolve the issue, whether it's dealing with mental health, whether it's a disagreement, and they walk individuals through this process and connect them to services and agencies that will help them deal with the root causes of violence. Policing doesn't do that. Police need to be laser focused on violent crimes or crimes that are happening in the community that's already take place. What we have to do, and it's critical, is that we no longer put the onus on a Connecticut against gun violence or even the Office of Violence Prevention. We have to leverage all assets in the ecosystem to mitigate violence in the same way we address COVID. It has to be everybody's problem, most importantly, the community. And that's how the clearance rate in all of these cities are going to change when you allow people in the community to take ownership and say, hey, this is all of our problems. All of us are impacted by violence. It impacts all of our taxes, because what people don't understand is that we're paying for violence whether we want to or not. Because what happens with that $280 billion that has to be paid for, we're paying for it through our tax dollars. So I would much rather the community be involved in quelling it, because what has become the problem is not only have we given small organizations meager financing or meager grants, but then we put all the responsibility on an organization we gave $2 or $3 million to stop a $5 or $10 billion problem. That's not just going to happen. So we have to leverage all the asset in the ecosystems, and cities and counties have to be able to designate or connect them to these network of resources that allow them to connect individuals to these streams of resources to help them mitigate these challenges they're having with violence.
So Chico, and anyone can answer this as well. So we can all agree, I mean, all the panelists, this truly, gun violence truly is a public health crisis, right? Why why hasn't it been declared a public health crisis and treated as such by cities and states across the country? You know, and where does race play in all this?
That's the easy answer. Is because it's segregated. Most of the gun violence is happening in two spaces. It's race and class, not just African Americans, but in poor neighborhoods. So what happened is it's not impacting individuals with influence and power. And the sad part is we wouldn't even be having those conversations today had we not had those mass shootings. The spike in mass shootings that impacted affluent white neighborhoods rallied everyone up and said, hey, we got to do something about it. I want to say one more thing. Something that was real alarming is what the Attorney General said when the mass shooting took place a few weeks ago in Detroit. She was the first person I ever heard come out and say, hey, after this shooting, this is a terrorist act. And she even went so far to say, not only is every student traumatized through vicarious and direct trauma, but she said the community is traumatized. And then she said the whole city is traumatized. Now imagine cities like New Orleans or Chicago that go through this daily. I wasn't happy to hear her say it, but it gave them an idea of what some of these vulnerable communities go through daily.
Yeah, absolutely. Far more media was paid on, you know, on the shooting that just happened, the school shooting, than on the day-to-day shootings that we see all the time in places like New Haven and Bridgeport and Hartford and New Orleans and et cetera, et cetera. And we need to change that. So John, let me bring it back to you, because one of the things that I'm curious about is some of the kids and some of the people that are in the film, and we had some questions in the chat room also about this. You know what, this film was made almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So people like Matt Gray, the student who said that it's easier to get a gun than textbooks, right, in the movie. Have you followed up? Do you know what has become of any of these people? Because I know, at least, you know, from, you know, the thing that is in the back of my mind and everyone's back of the mind is like, is what has become of them? You know, when we especially in this movie, when we hear about, you know, people not expecting to live past 21, 24, you know, and this lack of hope that was permeated throughout this movie from some of the young people. Have you followed up, or do you know what has become of Matt Gray or Devin or Cece or Josh?
Yeah. So, you know, now they're fortunately all the kids that participated in the documentary program that made Shell Shock are alive. They're all now young parents. You know, they're now in their mid-20s, and you know, they have varying degrees of success, you know, but all of their lives are a different kind of struggle now as being young, you know, young adults and young parents. You know, Cece has a daughter. She has started her own salon business. She worked at she worked as a sheriff's deputy in Orleans Parish Prison for a little while because her mother worked there. She tried to go to school and she had trouble. You know, she went to a high school that was about a mile away from Dillard University, which is a HBCU. She had a full ride, and then she had trouble her first semester because the education that she got in high school did not prepare her for the workload that Dillard would bring to her, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about because Dillard is less than a mile from where she went to high school. So as far as like that, there should have been ways that a person as driven as she is and as intelligent as she is to be able to make that transition into a higher education. But you know, but because she is a resourceful person, her life path has now made her into like she has her own business, and she is doing very well as far as like with hair. Matt was in the military for a little bit, tried to go back to school. He had struggles with school. Josh, I believe, he's between Houston and New Orleans, and he's working in kitchens, and he is trying to co-parent with a partner that they're not seeing eye to eye, but they have a child. Same thing with Dalen. And so the thing is that it's like it's a continue. Now they're adults. It's a continuing of the same kind of struggle to where they would really benefit if they had more resources, if they had more things that kind of help support them. But they're doing the best they can, which is, if you think about what you saw in the film, that's pretty much what it has been for them, their entire life. So they're doing the best that they can. Sorry, what was the rest of your question?
No, I mean, I guess that was, people were asking what has become of them, because we know way too well that the chances are pretty high that they something horrible will happen to them, that especially based on the statistics of young Black men in cities in America, that the chances of them being killed by gun violence are great. It's the number one cause of gun violence between Black young people ages 14 to 34. I think gun violence is still the number one cause of death.
Yeah.
So does anyone else on the panel have any thoughts about or questions about some of the young people that they saw in the movie, and whether some of those things are familiar with some of the youth that you've worked with?
Yeah, just one quick point connected to that is that, for those of us who've experienced gun violence at a young age and experienced it, well into their adult years, when you think about those kids in the documentary, there's also something else to consider, right? Economic violence, right? So although they may have survived some of the violence in their community, the question is whether or not they'll be economically mobile enough to contribute towards the advancement of their community, right? So, like, to continue in basically, on the economic fringe and not be able to see your community flourish, I think is also something that needs to be tackled. So when you think about the causal factors, the point was made earlier that, it's not just about race, it's also about class. The economic conditions play a big role. And so if we don't have young people who are coming out of our neighborhoods able to thrive, own a home in their neighborhood, increase the property value in the neighborhood. And yes, there's a lot of other things that go along with that, but if they're just getting by, that's not sufficient enough. And so I think we need to think about how we're investing in communities beyond violence intervention.
And also, I just wanted to add, being from New Orleans and seeing it firsthand, it hit home with me for the simple fact that that's how we raised. We have a mantra in New Orleans: get it how you live. Where, for instance, in my situation, I was doing good in school until my brother got murdered. And when my brother got murdered, it was a situation of, well, you got to retaliate. And so me getting into trouble, I wind up getting 3 armed robbery convictions, having to serve 13 years in prison. And you just see that the mind, it shifts into this culture of New Orleans where it's hurting. And I like to now when I talk to students and I go places, in 2018, the #1 song in the country was "In My Feelings" by Drake. And most of the violence that's happening in our city is people who are in their feelings and don't know how to address that. We've not done a good job of teaching emotional intelligence. We teach sex education in school now. We teach DEI and all this other stuff that it's trendy or whatever. but we haven't really done a good job of teaching kids how to handle emotions. And so with New Orleans, when you're dealing with hurricanes, poverty, racism, attacks from the police, all these things, and these kids are absorbing it, and they're taught to be quiet, don't talk when adults are speaking, go to your room, and you get in front of a game, and your only outlet for all these things that you're seeing is to have these shooter gangs that emulate real life and frustration through this video or whatever, or live through this music that's telling you it's okay to kill, die, be a gang, trill, or whatever. It has to come out because no one has really gave you a condition of learning of how to deal with those thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And we need to start putting that into the curriculum as young as possible to where kids grow with the emotional intelligence of anger is real. You just need to know how to deal with it in a more positive way. I tell people also, New Orleans is a pit bull culture. We're the only city where we're raised like pit bulls. We're bred to destroy one another. And we have to stop that. But again, it goes back to the emotional intelligence learning that's missing from our school's curriculum.
Chico?
I think what I saw in the movie was real relatable. And the reason why I say that is because some of the things that the youth said, I've experienced either directly or people around me. I grew up in the Austin community in Chicago, which is the most violent community in Chicago numerically. This year, Austin has over 100 homicides alone, and about close to 300 and somebody is shot every day in my community, every day. And every other day, somebody is killed. So me thinking about not making it to 25 was a challenge when I was growing up, and I could relate to it. And I see some of the challenges as a young Black male that we go through in impoverished neighborhoods. So and people, it's not talked about, but most Black males have to learn a skill that's not in other cultures, and that's how to navigate through communities to stay alive, who not to talk to, who not to hang around, what not to get involved with. If you stop by the police, you got to do this. Some of the drills or things we're taught are non-traditional, but are essential for our survival. So that's what I was relating to as I heard the people, the young men talk. It's things we were taught when we were young. Like, if the police stop you, don't say nothing. Don't look down and do exactly what they say. Things like that. And you see other cultures, they're taught in a much different way. And then with this scarcity in all of these communities, we talking about poverty and racism, it create the same atmosphere that the young man talked about. That was a beautiful. I just want to send a shout out to the filmmaker. That was a beautiful illustration, John, about the 10 sandwiches thrown in among 30 people. And that's what happens in our community, really. They throw 10 sandwiches or invest so little that everybody ends up competing or grappling or fighting over the little resources. Whereas when we go into our counterparts communities, it's an abundance of resources. Something as simple as this, and I want you to think about this, both John and Jeremy. Many African Americans throughout the United States, when they want to play athletics, and particularly not so much basketball, one of the reasons why so many of us play basketball is because it's the cheapest sport to play. All you need is a rim and a basketball. But a lot of us play football on concrete or glass lot. Many of us, in order to learn to play any other sport outside of basketball, have to travel to a white neighborhood, period. Or you're not going to learn the sport or join a team that's predominantly white. And if you think about that with every other activity in life, that there takes some equipment or some resources, Blacks usually don't participate in it. The number one sports where Blacks dominate is track and field. Why? because to race one another, what? The cost of equipment is cheap. If you think about where we excel, it's where there's little investment and we're given the maximum opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chico. So, John, just so many, just to echo what Chico said, there's just so many points in this movie that really resonated. Just so many moments, whether it's the part where the woman is talking about, looking at the graves and describing that these are our neighbors, these are our people. Then you move on to the next one. The need for humanizing these deaths, saying their names, this murder board that they had. The discussion about the common ground with pizza night, how the 10th ward wasn't supposed to talk, and the idea of food, all of these other things. But I think, what the thing that's was most chilling to me was the T-shirt shop that had to, that in order to be in business, he said there were, they just had to create T-shirts for people who were, rest in peace, and that there were 20 other T-shirt shops just like that within a 3-mile radius. But the one thing that is clear, John, I think, is that number one, this is a public health crisis, and number two, that gun violence isn't the disease. It is a symptom of a bigger thing that Chico and Patrick and Brent have been talking about. So I want to ask one final question amongst the panelists, which is this: a film like this, what is, whether this is addressed to, people who are survivors, whether it's people who've experienced this, or this is being watched by politicians who can make the kind of change, like what is the takeaway from this? What is it that you would like them to know or learn from this film, John? And I'll send it to the rest of the panel as well.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about originally with, we all agree that gun violence is abhorrent, and it's something that doesn't contribute to the well-being of a community and all this kind of stuff. But if we don't prioritize it in the right, in the right way, then it's something that will continue. It will continue to wreck neighborhoods, like putting these youth programs, to be funded, self-funded oftentimes by these people, and they get overwhelmed with it because they don't have any help, and they end up getting burned out, and they take this huge load upon their own shoulders, and they're really fighting a war of attrition, just trying to save as many kids as they can, as opposed to really addressing the problem. Is it going to solve it? And another thing I've thought about, when we're talking about, like, as far as like it can't be incremental, like it can't be, here and there. I think that when we don't fund youth programs correctly, the thing that actually happens is, a kid becomes reliant on a youth program, and starts to get some of those resources that any child should get, right? Like as far as like support, positive adult guidance. That youth program folds for whatever reason. They don't have enough money. That they get burned out. They don't get any help. You've done a huge disservice to that kid, because this thing that they come to rely on is pulled out from underneath them, and there's no way to explain to a child in a good way that, well, we just couldn't afford it anymore, or that it makes them feel like that they're not important, which is a part of the problem. And to something that Chico, that you said that I was thinking about is, how can you expect a person, especially a young person, to really have a healthy value of life when everything that you're putting out there around them shows that you don't value their life or their environment? And so I think that we know what the solutions are. We know what we need to do. The problem is that we're not ready to do the heavy lifting. But I'll take that back. As far as like one of the things that Chico, what Biden is doing, what you've helped put, bring along into with him is the important thing. Like that's the heavy lifting. Putting our money where our mouth is, and then also not just putting the money there, but also actually putting in the effort. Like this is now the time to actually put in the work. So That's what I think should be the takeaways.
Patrick, still with us? Chico, what would you like? If there's one thing you want to drive home, what do you want people to know?
It's not so much what I want people to know. I think I want people to get involved, to do something. I want people to utilize their platform, their power, their talent, and do something about it. I think the takeaway would be that violence is all of our problems. And I would want us to approach it in the same way COVID. We need everybody, all hands on deck to change it. And I'll tell you this is the last thing I think that's critical. We need a marketing strategy that makes it uncool to be violent. We got to move toward that it's not tolerated even by the neighborhood, that we're not going to condone that type of behavior. I think as America, we have highlighted individuals who are infamous, and we have to stop, and it's coming back to bite us. Whether it's in the movies, whether it's in the community, whatever, we got to say that behavior is no longer acceptable.
Thank you, Chico. Brent, last but definitely not least.
Chico, man, I really appreciate that, because that's exactly what I was thinking. When is Black trauma going to cease to be the trigger for investment? Right? It's like it's always off of Black suffering, not Black joy. Like, no one looks at a Black man or Black woman who achieves something and says, now we're going to double down on our investment so we can accelerate that kind of success. It's always towards addressing some issue. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't. Obviously, we're here talking about the importance of that, but that narrative gets echoed, right? And so earlier when I remarked on where is the murder capital, it's in my psyche, right? That's where it really lives, So it doesn't matter what hood I'm in. I'm thinking about surviving. I'm thinking about my life, and I'm thinking about the environment in a particular way that really puts a ceiling on my aspirations. Earlier as you remarked, you don't expect to live past a certain age. I used to have nightmares that I was murdered. I didn't plan my life up to a certain age, because I didn't have those kinds of aspirations. You dream, but it's almost like a fairy tale. Chico's right. I think that concomitant with, or I would say along with the investment to reduce gun violence and the range of areas that require investment, right? We need a communications plan, right? So for every small win, that has to be boosted. I mean, it would be super ideal if hip hop culture resembled the contemporary hip hop culture, I should say, the mainstream contemporary hip hop culture resembled the culture that I grew up in. As I grew up with superheroes like KRS One and Rakim. And, I had a lot of negative influences around me, but I can put on my headphones and tune out and gain knowledge of self. And it was through understanding my self-identity as an African here in North America and connecting myself to a historical legacy gave me a sense of confidence, spurred me to become more mature and dignified in how I conducted myself. And it also provided me with a way to articulate to my peers why I wasn't going to go down a certain path. And it was respected as such, right? So, I think that there's a lot of work to do. Some of it is the work that we need to do within our own communities. We got to talk a different talk. But I do agree with Chico wholeheartedly that, we need the communications and the marketing plan to go along with it.
Thank you, Brent. John, what a fabulous film. It's one of those things, I'm sorry it had to be made, but grateful that you made it. Chico, so glad you could join us. Thank you for your sage words and advice. And Brent, as always, thank you so much for keeping up the fight. And, if you're watching at home, the hour is up, but we know this conversation has to continue. And to echo what Chico said, CAGV, we are an organization about action. So we wouldn't be doing our job unless we did something after this, because the real work starts after this movie is watched and after this panel is over. That's when we all have to get together and start the real work. It doesn't end just with watching this movie. So we are going to continue to push the Connecticut Initiative to Prevent Community Gun Violence, to try to create an Office of Violence Prevention like they've done in New Orleans, to focus on community gun violence in a way that Connecticut hasn't done before, and to make sure that those communities communities are having their needs met, to establish grants that are going to go directly to organizations that are boots on the ground organizations that are doing this work a lot of times when we sleep, and to make sure that these programs are supported and that they're effective, and that the community is central to all this. So we're going to be pushing this at the state. We're working with the city of New Haven. We have a formal partnership with the city of New Haven to try to create a blueprint for their brand new Office of Violence Prevention. Along with the community, we're going to help to create a blueprint, and we're hoping to do that with Bridgeport in 2022 and 2023. So thank you again, gentlemen, for joining us. There will be an email that goes out if you're watching, where you can take action and how you can take action, how you can help us do this work in Connecticut and the rest of the country. I also will get information from our panelists. If there's any organizations that you would like people to know about, Chico, John, and Brent, please give us that information, and we will spread it to our supporters so that they can know about some of the organizations that you love and support and work with, so that we can spread the wealth. So thank you again, everyone out there. Please be safe, and let's be the change we want to see in the world.
All right. Hey, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.